Hello, my name is JT Justice. I am a doctoral student at Liberty University Online in their history program. And today I want to talk to you about my proposed research topic regarding my dissertation, and that is the political activities of the Southern Agrarians. When I was an undergraduate, I had a very interesting English professor that convinced me to get a minor in English. And so I took most of his courses that he offered in order to get that minor. And one of the courses I took that he taught was called Modern American Literature. And in that course, I read a number of different books, but the one that stood out the most to me was All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, which to this day remains my favorite novel. But as I was reading this book and I did more research on Warren for a presentation I had to give in a class, I learned more about Warren and his involvement with the Southern Agrarians. And the more research I did on the agrarians, the more I became interested in their ideas and their critique of modern society. And then I found out that these men were also political actors, that they tried to get their ideas out of academia and tried to influence the modern political scene, which they weren't terribly successful at, unfortunately for them. But I thought this was something that deserved more research, especially as many of the histories that I read on the agrarians either would avoid talking about it, or either they just glossed over it, or they would only have smaller sections dedicated to talking about it without going into much depth as to their policies, as to their political activities. I think would be very beneficial for us here in the day, for in the present day, to study more. So, for my topic, as I said, I want to study the agrarians as political actors, not as philosophers, and not as literary figures, as often many historians tend to do, whether they are more appreciative of the agrarians or whether they're hostile to the agrarians. And so I believe that my research here can fill in a gap regarding the historiography of the agrarians by looking at the agrarians as political actors trying to influence public policy during their day. Now, for my dissertation, I don't just want to provide a chronology regarding the agrarians, although I think that's what I want to do ultimately. But I also want to contextualize the agrarians within the political scene of the 1930s. It was a wild west of ideas. Uh, when during the Great Depression, liberal democracy, as we understand it, was very much questioned by a number of very prominent and intellectual people across the political spectrum, from communists to fascists. But you also had other popular figures such as Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin, and then you had some more fringe ideas like social credit and technocracy. So all of these ideas were calling into question the traditional, in that day, liberal democracy and how it was effective in dealing with the crises of its day. And so, ideas that the agrarians had, which to us may seem, fringe and almost kooky, which I think is a mischaracterization of their ideas, but nevertheless, these ideas that they had were ones that the public might have seriously considered, just given how bad the Great Depression was. And so, in my analysis of the Southern agrarians as political actors, I want to contextualize them in that very chaotic political scene of 1930s America, and especially their relationship to the New Deal, which the agrarians tended to be much more ambivalent in their support of. There were some things they really liked about the New Deal and some things they didn't really like about it. But for the most part, I want to juxtapose them against the New Deal as well as other movements that were trying to vie for the public attention at that time. And so my hope is in doing research for this topic is to not only uncover the Southern agrarians and their connections to some of these other fringe movements at the time, but I also want to wrestle with the question as to how do we categorize the agrarians politically. In my research regarding the agrarians, those that again tend to be either hostile or even very favorable to the agrarians tend to classify them as reactionaries. That is, these were conservatives that longed for something beyond beyond liberal democracy, beyond the old constitutional government that was prevalent in the United States, and rather they wanted to go back to an ancient medieval ideal, which I could see why some would come to that conclusion based on the writings of some of the agrarians, but I think the issue as to their political position was actually far more complicated, especially given the fact that the agrarians were, number one, as I mentioned earlier, they were much more amenable to the New Deal than one might suspect. But the second thing is that the agrarians were also much more radical in their proposals than even Franklin Roosevelt or some of his supporters were willing to advocate. And so I think that the agrarians are, especially during their political phase between 1930 and 1940, are in much need of a reevaluation regarding a modern analysis of their political position. I think there's enough evidence actually to suggest that the agrarians might even be placed on the political left. However, I want to save on any conclusions at this stage because I want to do more research into their policy proposals and their affiliation with other groups to make a much more informed assessment regarding the agrarians. But anyway, I think that these ideas are actually very relevant to the present, especially since we live in an age rather, not that dissimilar to the 1930s as it comes to questioning of the current order. Fringe ideas across the spectrum, even many of them which we thought were dead, are now making a comeback. And I think studying the agrarians and their attempts to break into the political scene can offer us some answers as to how those ideas are able to enter the public discourse, if at all, and why some of these fringe ideologies might fail. So I think that a study of the agrarians can prove very relevant to the present, especially when it comes to fringe movements and their influence in political discourse. So anyway, and this is JT Justice, and I hope you all have a good day.